So a few things about myself. I grew up in Canada as the son of English parents. And in 1999, while in my 20s, I moved here to London and took a job at a dot-com startup. It was my first job in an online business, a UK-based online fashion startup, where one of our biggest struggles was actually trying to sell online subscriptions to many companies whose staff didn't even have internet access back in those days. Not a huge surprise. In 2001, I was made redundant in a round of cost savings. The company did survive and actually went on to do great things, but not with me there. But yeah, so a few months later, I landed in Costa Rica to work at a sports gambling business that was dealing with the struggles of making the switch to from telephone betting to online betting. Over the years, I've held quite a few positions at a variety of gambling companies, leading their IT teams. I've also worked at some platform providers, and I've worked on and off as well as a consultant. So although my specialty is not information security, it has always been an important part of my role. And preventing and recovering from DDoS attacks, an important part of that. Mm. Right. Not much on that slide. Anyways. So yes, I'll run through some of the history that I have with dealing with DDoS attacks. As I said, in my career in online gambling started in 2002. My first experience with a DDoS attack came only a few months after I arrived, when one of our Las Vegas-based operators was taken down through a DDoS attack. Not long after that, sort of the spring of 2003, we received our first threat of being taken offline if we did not pay a small ransom. Very small, I think it was. And we didn't pay, but fortunately nothing happened. However, in the fall of 2003, we received our next ransom note, pay $50,000. I think it was to like a web money account, or your site will be taken offline. Again, we didn't pay, but sure enough, this time we received a large DDoS attack that took our site down. So at that time, this is again 2003, so we had our website split. So we had what we called the marketing content, so images and static content hosted in a few different co-locations. But we had the core of the gambling platform running from our server room in Costa Rica. And back then we were fed by a mixture of satellite internet links and broadband links. I think the largest might have been about 2 megabits per second. Through our contacts in the industry, we found that we were not the only company being targeted in a similar way. In fact, quite a few of our competitors were also down around the same periods of time. Later on, we would find out that the attacks were coming from an organized Russian group of extortionists. We didn't know that at the time, but eventually that kind of news came out. So since this was 2003, we went with a kind of a three-pronged approach. We needed to increase our web server capacity to try to be able to handle this extra load that we were receiving from the DDoS attacks. We needed to build the ability to block IP addresses. So we heard that today, things haven't changed. And we needed to protect our network layer. In this case, we were trying to hide it, so that it wasn't too obvious where that was. But we knew we needed some help. We were fighting these attacks round the clock, finding IP addresses, trying to block them, trying to optimize the way we would block these IP addresses. First using at different layers. Again, I'm not super technical, but I just remember that they were trying to find more efficient ways to block IP addresses on these web servers. But we needed this help. So in those early days and weeks, a group of similar businesses worked together. And from that collaboration, a new company was formed to be solely focused on these DDoS attacks. And eventually this company became known as Prolexic Technologies. And in 2014, that Prolexic was sold to Akamai for $370 million. Okay. So the problem was complicated, right? Some of the attacks were greater than the available bandwidth for the entire country of Costa Rica. Prolexic set up their hardware in the US, and the plan was pretty straightforward. route all web traffic through Prolexic, and for them to scrub before proxying it to our servers. Another important move back in those days was to protect our DNS records. And we signed with a company called Newstar for their Ultra DNS product. DNS servers are often is also targeted. I think this has been mentioned in these attacks. And at the time, Ultra DNS was the first product out there leveraging the IP Anycast technology, which made it a lot more resilient than what we'd been using up until then. So the DDoS attacks continued. A few came with ransom demands, but with most of them, we were clueless about what they were after. Prolexic was definitely a great system, and we survived quite a few of these DDoS attacks because of them, but it was still far from a magic bullet. Some attacks would go undetected and get through, causing downtime, and also the technology being used by Prolexic was still quite immature, and on multiple occasions, we were down because Prolexic themselves were the ones having issues and we're down. Over those next years, I saw a lot of different approaches for mitigating DDoS attacks. Quite a few people went out and bought some of the earlier versions of hardware that was available specifically to filter out DDoS attacks. But I must say, in most of those cases, especially when it was end users doing this, they had very limited success. So in 2011, I was back in London. I started working for a different type of gambling company. They were no longer a startup, but they were still quite new to the market and budgets were tight. DDoS attacks were becoming a bigger problem and affecting the financial performance of the company. So right away, I suggested, to use Prolexic to them, but it felt they was too expensive for their young business. So it did cost more than some of the other providers on the market at the time. So we tried quite a few different options. Company is Media Secure and Dragonara. We spoke to VeriSign, Adversor. There were a lot of different products back then around. Some cheaper than others, and some worked better than others. So in the end, we did go with a company called Newstar, the same one from the Ultra DNS, and they had a product called CyProtect. And CyProtect worked like a lot of options back then. It monitors the network traffic, and when it detects an attack, it reroutes traffic through its scrubbing centers. So this meant that the attacks could be slow to be detected and mitigated in the world of sports betting. Certain times a day, especially like on weekends, 20, 30 minutes down can be very costly. It's costly, so this was a problem. So in 2012, was a new service on the market, Cloudflare. I think they'd been up and running for a year or two at that point. So unlike CyProtect, Cloudflare was an always-on service, and they had the added benefit that it was actually helped speed up our websites as well due to the way it was built and its caching layers. CDN services have been around for some time at this point, but the combination of DDoS and content acceleration for us was a winner. I think around the same time, also Incapsula, I believe are an Israeli company, also came onto the market with a similar product. So once we moved our websites to Cloudflare, we still needed that CyProtect because Cloudflare at the time was only offering application layer 7, which we were hearing about earlier, protection. So we still needed to protect our network infrastructure. A lot of this back then was difficult and was challenging. There were a lot of different products on the market, but it was still, a lot of them were selling goods that they couldn't really deliver. The attacks were evolving at the same time. When we moving actually to Cloudflare, I think you called it a cloud service provider, right? Yes. CDN cloud service provider. So that was a good combination for us. This was also, a little bit before kind of the big move towards public cloud, like yourself. But also actually just thinking about it too, the talk earlier from the NBIB, right? Yes. I mean, that's also, to me, is like a fantastic advancement. Having been kind of on those front lines 20 years ago when there was kind of nothing, and sort of seeing that and that approach, yeah, it's, that was actually quite, eye opening to me and things like this, that you're doing that. But anyways, um, okay, next I just wanted to go through it'll get there. Some of the basics. Um, some of these have already been touched on. Some of them have been kind of covered probably a little bit better than I can do. I don't think too much contradicts what I'm saying, but maybe there was a few bits and pieces. But as a person who has the responsibility to ensure the availability and reliability of public-facing websites, really my concerns can be simplified into two areas. The first area is to ensure that the websites and the online applications infrastructure is protected, using a service that can handle what is thrown at it from a brute force point of view. This could be SYN floods or TCP-X. That was a new one for me, the HTTP2 reset, DNS amplifications, these types of attacks. And then for me, the second thing to worry about is how my applications have been designed and making sure that they haven't been left to be exposed to more targeted attacks, which are designed to sniff out those weaknesses. All right. So for the first category, the DDoS protection providers. Again, I'm not an expert on this, and I'm also not here to sell any of these products, but I'm just going to give you from my perspective, right? So the first concern is pretty straightforward. There are very good providers in the market today that can provide protection from all kinds of attacks, right? If you have services running on premise, then you need to protect both the application layer of your websites and the APIs, as well as the infrastructure layer, which essentially means protecting, your networks, which you covered a little bit earlier. You do need to be covered in the cloud, concern when you're in the cloud as well, the public cloud. But if you're using one of the public cloud providers, they will be able to do this for you, as we heard just before me talking here. But for the protection, you want to have all traffic. In my opinion, you want to have all the traffic pass through the DDoS provider. If not, then the detection can be slow. And then if you have limited network capacity, something that would be common for medium-sized organizations, then your network could be overwhelmed and you would go down. So better to have the setup in which all traffic passes through the provider 100% of the times. As you said, it was a clean pipe, yeah? Again, that's from my experiences. But again, with these kinds of setup, there's still challenges for running things on premise. First of all, by having all your network traffic run through a third-party provider, you can start increase the latency. And depending on what services you're providing, that can be problematic. You need to be careful about any endpoint that you publish publicly, especially if they are not included in your DDoS protection, and restrict access to them as much as possible. Some basics, yeah? Voice, SNS, and T servers, as examples, they can pose a particular challenge. Although some of the anti-DDoS providers do have specialty features for proxying TCP and UDP traffic, they're not always compatible with some services, right? So I've seen examples, for example, with SMTP, with anti-malware or antivirus applications do not behave properly when they don't have the direct access to the SMTP server. So when it's being proxied, it's unable to kind of understand properly what it needs to do. Okay. Then for protecting your applications, understanding and protecting the design of your website, that takes more work. You explained this, and I think this is kind of a common theme here today, right? Attackers like to find potential weaknesses, and they go after those. Usually these attacks are a lot smaller in terms of raw requests than the big attacks, but they're often a lot harder to detect and mitigate. So advances in tools often used to test websites. I think someone had that on one of their slides as well, right? Allow attackers to simulate traffic that is hard to distinguish from legitimate traffic. This is something in a recurring theme in the information security worlds, right? Tools built for good are then used for bad. I guess it applies outside of information security as well, but it's another story. things that can help. So, if you use a CDN for static content, this does help in several ways. You know, these days, the use of a CDN is kind of pretty standard for site performance because it delivers the content faster to the end user. And for the same reason, it's a good defense against DDoS attacks. One of the earlier lessons too that we had back in those first few days when dealing with DDoS attacks, that actually outbound traffic can actually make things often worse than inbound traffic. So a lot of requests for like something like an image that your web servers are trying to serve will actually plug your pipes, but on the outbound way. So yes, so by using a CDN, you have the less amount of content being served from your origin servers, and therefore the better. Again, closely related to CDNs is also caching, and caching of the content, which is important for these same reasons, right? So serving content from an edge cache instead of from its origin servers is lighter and cheaper, and will also protect origin servers in the case of a huge spike in demand for that content. As some of us know, caching can be one of the hardest things to do when you're building websites, and so making mistakes can make all the difference with dealing with DDoS attacks, as well as the actual overall performance of your websites. The last thing here, and I think it kind of sounds obvious, but it's important, and it's the same today as it was back in those early days. You need to scale up your applications so that they have plenty of spare capacity, right? Now, if this is done statically, then you can do it statically. Or now there's a lot of options that you can use elastic capacity that can scale up on demand. In your graph there with the education, you could see that even when a lot of it was filtered, there was still 50% increase in demand, so to be able to handle that kind of spike in capacity is important. Depending on some of our industries are very used to that elastic demand, a campaign goes viral or a particular day or things like this, In the sports betting world, we have a few days of the year, like the Grand National, where our traffic just spikes 4 or 5 times what we're used to seeing, But in other businesses, possibly in education, things like this, that we were hearing about, those large traffic spikes are probably not as common. So having that extra capacity. All right, I did put a list again of the DDoS providers. I kind of wanted to recognize some of us that were in this room today and some of the companies that I've specifically worked with. Again, this is not a full list. These are kind of the ones that I'm kind of aware of and sort of follow what they're doing and the features that their releases. And I know there's some others. I met one earlier today who's not on the list. But what we can see here and what I want to try to really point out is that these days there's a lot of really good options out there. And most of these will offer a lot more advanced features that are also very important, right? Features like the web application firewall that we've heard in a few different places, right? Web application firewalls has a lot of uses beyond just DDoS attacks, but it's an important part, right? So how am I doing? I'm over on time. Sorry. Okay. What? 2 more minutes. All right. Anyways, we've heard some of these things before, so I'm not going to go through it. So rate limiting, restricting access, geolocation, you said that's an important thing. If you're not operating in a certain part of the world, you don't need to take traffic from there. Bot mitigation and API shield, which I think kind of go hand in hand. The other thing that's kind of important is to monitor your websites for unusual changes in traffic. So a lot of people do alerts. Am I up? Am I down? How my server is performing and everything like this. But not everybody remembers to put in alerts there to see, like, have I had a jump in traffic? It might not have affected anything. I might be running smooth, but to know that you've all of a sudden are getting 10 times more logins than you had previously is an important thing and can sometimes be an early warning. All right, I want to jump to here. So looking forward, as an operator, the limit to doing house expertise that I can support, there's a limit, I'm sorry. So just like in other areas of information security, it's important to work with the experts who are tapped into other organizations and who have seen different things. And so that they can bring that depth of experience with them, again, as an end user. One of the biggest challenges with protecting something against DDoS is you don't really know you're protected until the attack happens. In other cases, and yes, we can do simulations and I'll talk about that, but it's kind of like if you're building the flood defenses for a town or a village or a port. You know, you hope you have done enough. You see the water rising, but at this end of the day, all you can do is kind of really pray and trust that you've done it. And if you've made a mistake, it's kind of game over. Of course, certainly not in online gambling are we at the same level as protecting towns and villages, but I think you understand the analogy. And we hear it talked about floods all the time in the DDoS world. All right, looking forward. So this is true with the DDoS attacks too, right? You don't know. There are new attack types, new attack strategies, continuously increasing attack sizes, new features your developers have deployed and didn't, tell the security team. There's risk mistakes, your systems that were overlooked, all can result in downtime. So this is why, for me, even after 20 years of doing this and seeing how far these tools have advanced and the lessons learned and all the money invested, I'm never completely confident and we've done enough. Gambling industry is still a regular target of attacks, probably more so than it was even back in those early years. And I talked about the DDoS protection providers, and most of them will do more than just the onboarding. They will have, a lot of them have these response teams and everything like this. But despite all this, a couple of years ago, we started working with Red Button, one of our sponsors here today. And at first, I actually wasn't convinced. I said, okay, we'll try it for a year. But I must say that, we've been really happy with this because even though we had a solid internal security team and we'd managed to mitigate quite a few attacks before they did any damage, we'd worked on incident response. I think that was not at that level, but we had, done some of this, at least tabletopping. And we were able to adapt quite quickly when we had a DDoS attack that took us down. But that was kind of the problem. They had taken us down, So we decided to try Red Button out for a year. We did the full audit, like you talked about, and go through the setup on our tools. But working with a partner has really been able to allow us to fine tune. I lost myself too on my prison. Fine tune that what we have. Here we go. Things like rate limiting, bot protection, API shield. These are great tools, but they take time, they take investment, they need to be done properly. You're always walking a fine line between stopping the bad actors and not blocking legitimate customers. Bot mitigation in particular has been very problematic for us, trying to filter out bad traffic. We operate some legacy sites and they get false positives and everything like this. And the last thing too is, as we're seeing these providers, whether it be AWS or Radware or Cloudflare or Imperva, they're coming out with new tools and new techniques to counteract what's coming out on the other side all the time. And staying on top of this is a lot of work, so working with a third party has really helped us with that as well. All right, so that's a bit of my story, my take on what needs to be done, and I hope you found it interesting, and thank you very much.